Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another Bronf Talk. If you were here yesterday, we were starting already this conversation about criminal justice reform. And really yesterday, we looked at sort of the problems in the criminal justice system and where it breaks down. And today, we're really going to try to concentrate as much as possible on the path forward and what reform could actually look like. And we just have an amazing panel. And today on Juneteenth, it's a time to celebrate freedom and to reflect on how far we are from that place. So I'll try to avoid doing more talking because this is a perfect conversation to be having right now. But before I introduce our panelists, if there are any questions at any point, I know we have so many alumni who are in this conversation who are working in this space, either as activists or as professionals. And so I do want this to be a conversation as much as possible. So there should be a sort of participant you can find that says questions. And so if you see that, you can just kind of ask a question at any point, and I'll try to include everyone in the community as much as possible. So let me introduce our panelists. Tali Farhadian Weinstein was a 92 fellow. She's a prosecutor, professor, and criminal justice reformer. She served in the Department of Justice, first as counsel to Attorney General Eric Holder under President Obama, and then as a federal prosecutor. She's currently the general counsel of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, which under the leadership of Eric Gonzalez is regarded as a national model of progressive prosecution. Thanks for joining us, Tali.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. And if I may just further credentialize myself for a moment, I was also the madrija on Bronfman for 3 summers.
That's right, and I just learned a counselor to Becky, which is a big scoot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And Adam Mansky is the parent of a recent Bronfman Fellow. He's Director of Criminal Justice for the Center for Court Innovation. He originally joined the center to plan the path-breaking Red Hook Community Justice Center, and then served as Red Hook's first project director. Since then, he's helped create and supervise many of the center's cutting-edge criminal justice programs throughout the New York area. And he has his BA from the University of Michigan and a JD cum laude from NYU School of Law. Hi, Adam.
Hey, it's so nice to be part of this conversation on this day and at this time. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. And Kingsley Rowe, who has been involved in the Bronfman community through the Bronfman Center at NYU, he became justice involved at the age of 19, serving 10 years as a result of the mishandling of an illegal firearm and causing the accidental death of a close friend. While in prison, Kingsley earned his associate degree from St. Francis University's Prison Education Program, and then he earned both his Bachelor of Science and Master of Social Work from NYU. He's worked at Manhattan Criminal Court as a senior social worker, and he spearheaded the prison reintegration response for the NYU Prison Education Program, and currently heads up the reentry unit at the New York County Defender Services. Hi, Kingsley.
Oh, thank you, Adam. I really appreciate being included in this conversation. I think it's important. And happy Juneteenth to my family out there.
Absolutely, great to have you. So I think that, maybe a good place to jump in will be to talk about everyone's background on this panel and, what led you to this work and sort of what are the animating principles behind the work you're doing right now. Tali, and I know Tali, you're really speaking on behalf of yourself rather than the DA's office, but I would love to hear what you're thinking about in your work right now.
Why do any of us do whatever it is that we do? I can tell you that for me, I go back, when I think about what is the model for law enforcement and what are the values that I want to put into the world as a person who practices in law enforcement, I go back to the very first night that I was in America. So I came here as a refugee from Iran. When I was a kid, I was just 4 years old, and we happened to land at JFK Airport on Christmas Eve of 1979, 40 years ago. And I would not then, or my parents would not then have had any of the language that I have now to describe what we were doing and what happened to us that night. But now I understand that we probably had, almost certainly had, what were fake tourist visas. and were definitely not tourists, and didn't understand that at the port of entry you were supposed to explain that you had a credible fear of persecution from the place that you were originally coming from, in order to be able to make an asylum claim and have that adjudicated in the American immigration system. And so what happened to us instead was just we got lucky, and there was an act of grace, and probably because it was a holiday, not a holiday that we celebrate, the officer who inspected us, the INS officer, an agency that doesn't exist anymore, granted us deferred inspection. So we had permission to enter the country, even though we didn't have authorization to enter the country because we didn't have any papers that were corresponded to what we were actually trying to do. And he told us to come back after the holiday to basically get self-deport. I also am now aware of the fact that my father was standing on, he had come ahead of us, so he was standing on the other side of immigration control, and my mother told the officer that, and that we had been separated as a family, and that was meaningful to him. He said, "Don't worry, I understand that the kids want to see their father." And so we came in and we found free lawyers through the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and we made an asylum claim, and a decade later, we wound up getting amnesty. So what do I draw out of that? To me, that was an exercise of discretion, which is a core concept. You asked me what are the values or what are the things that, I think are the touchstones, Adam, and how we practice law enforcement. It was an act of humanity. It was understanding that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law don't always overlap completely. And you have to use your judgment, to think about, what does this individual case really demand of me? How should I meet the people who are standing in front of me? And obviously, we're talking about a different kind of, we're talking about criminal law, not immigration law here. But the stakes are really high, and we deal with people who are vulnerable in the way that I was vulnerable. And I find for me, it is useful to sort of go back to that experience of vulnerability.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thanks, Tali.
Yeah.
Adam, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you got to your work at the Center for Court Innovation and the sort of big things that propel you there.
Yeah, that was a very powerful story, Tali, and mine is more pedestrian. I'm a Manhattan schmo whose parents came from Brooklyn and Bronx and now live back in Brooklyn. And I'll just say I'm an attorney. I graduated from law school owing many thousands of dollars of debt, worked for a couple big law firms for a few years, but wanted to turn my attention to helping New Yorkers and to thinking about system change. And so I joined the Center for Court Innovation a number of years ago, 1997, to plan one of what became one of our flagship projects, the Red Hook Community Justice Center. And let me just spend a minute talking about the Center for Court Innovation. We have been around for almost 30 years. We're a nonprofit, and we're dedicated to creating a more humane, fair, and effective justice system. And we do that in a few ways. First of all, we create pilot projects, kind of cutting edge, that are trying to rethink how the justice system works. And we also have moved into central systems, providing core direct service to thousands of justice-involved people each year. And we do that mostly through diversion, which I will come back to a little bit. And I don't like using that word diversion, but that's kind of what it is, essentially. And we also help other communities around the country, do their own forms of criminal justice reform or adapt to our models. We write and do research on this work. But I want to emphasize the three principles that kind of animate our work, because it is thinking in terms of the reform we do, and then I want to contextualize that for today. So the three things that I think really we're working to do. First is a belief in outcome fairness, that actually we believe in most instances community-based social services and supervision are better outcomes, are more fair than the traditional responses of jail, prison, and conviction. And so we're working to enable those, to make those the practice of the justice system as much as possible, working both with the Brooklyn DA's office and other DA's offices and the New York County defenders and other, defense agencies. And I can come back to that a little bit later. But the second thing that kind of informs our work, we talk about it as procedural justice, but at the end of the day, it's really about treating everyone who is part of the system or coming through the system, justice involved, with dignity and respect. That we think that those are important normative values, that the people coming through are not defendant or, kind of a dehumanized, thing or a body, as the system sometimes calls it, but are people. And so we're working to embed those values in how we interact with people and how the system does. And then finally, we believe wherever we can, we want to co-produce justice with the communities that we serve, and that actually the justice system is intended to serve individuals and communities and not just the state. And so we do quite a bit of community work where we're working with residents to help identify and define what safety means to them, and then find new ways or find ways to create justice and to involve communities in having a voice in doing that, including through restorative justice and other kinds of programming. So I can come back to some of that in a bit. But the other thing I just want to touch on is that what we're really talking about is our commitment to system change and to culture change. But we do work with government, and that's the way we have traditionally found our role to be effective. And I'll be honest, today is a time in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and in this time when we are confronting the historic and present racism of our systems, including the justice system, that it's a legitimate question. What is the right way to affect change? And we certainly have staff who are struggling, and me too, struggling with those kinds of questions. Is it best to change from within? Is that being part of the problem, or is that also helping to come up with solutions? So I'll stop at that note. Sorry to.
No, that's great, and we appreciate the kind of openness of struggling with that as we start off, and hopefully frame a lot of our discussion. So that's really great. Kingsley, I know you also have a very sort of personal story about how you got involved in this work, and so I'd love for you to share some of that and what you're doing now. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yes.
There we go.
So I appreciate Adam's words. I think actually that when you talk about systemic change and trying to change, I think that the community has everything that it needs to find solve the problem and offer solutions to that problem. Regarding my coming to criminal justice, I was criminal justice involved at 19. I was playing with a handgun, and I accidentally killed my friend. During that time, I was in Philadelphia. During that time, there was a lot of violence on the street with regard to guns. There was many murders every day in Philadelphia. And during that time, I went to jail, went to prison. It was when I came up for trial. I was in the midst of all that, and so when I was sentenced, I was sentenced to 8 to 20 years, and I wound up serving 10. But during that time, I was able to go to school, get my college degree while I was there. St. Francis had St. Francis College at the time, but at St. Francis University now, came into the prison and offered an associate degree for individuals who were incarcerated there. I was able to take advantage of the program and do extremely well. As I stated to Adam, like during that time, Bill Clinton signed the 1992 crime bill, and I was in the midst of almost completing. And so when he signed the crime bill, they took all Pell Grants out of state prisons, and no longer they were no longer accessible. But I was fortunate enough that St. Francis College, now university, decided to finish us up on their own dime. So I was able to finish. But that laid the foundation for me to go forward. So I was able to come out and work and go to school. So I worked full time, and I got into NYU, and I continued to build on that. Education has always sort of been very important to my family and I. Also, it has propelled me during my time in prison and afterwards. And I was able to follow up that and get a master's degree in social work from NYU as well. And so, based on my experiences, I wanted to honor my friend's life by working to solve many of the problems that plague our community, and many of the situations that, like myself, I found myself in. There were guns plethora. It was plethora of guns in my community, and all sorts of things. And when I decided to go to social work school, I wanted to be part of that solution, part of bringing about change within the community. And so I set out to do that in my work in social work.
That's great, and that's also extremely powerful. I wonder if you could talk about in kind of making the transition from prison, and reintegrating to society. Sort of, what were some of the structural barriers you saw when you got like how was parole set up for you?
Sure. Well, the thing is, you serve a lot of time, and they tell you that, you serve your time, you get out, you get a job, and do all the things. And there's they tell you to do this, but you have no tools, you have no education, you don't have any of those things. I was fortunate, like I said, to have a college degree coming out, but the barriers that were in my way were numerous. I think the first barrier was my parole officer. When I first met my parole officer for the first time, he told me to shut the hell up, and that's saying it nicely, and that I didn't enjoy any rights that he did not give me. And so you can imagine me coming out of a prison and having to navigate an individual who I've been put in the guardianship of, who has such a pejorative attitude of people coming out from prison. There were issues with regard to me getting employment. So I finished my school, and I was certified, but I was unable to work for the Board of Education, even though I had letters from all over, from people I've met, people I've worked for, scholars, academics. It's still like structural barriers, like to just doing the basic things. We talk about how, no sort of ID, no sort of programs to direct one when they're leaving society. If you expect if you expect for someone to be successful, you have to put them in situations where they can be successful. And I think a lot of times when you're coming out of a prison and into the probation and parole system, it becomes the antithesis of what you need to be successful. They talk about sort of defund police. I just think they should take a hard look at all sort of law enforcement, because probation and parole is sort of an extension of the prison system. They're not there to sort of help you navigate the system. They're there to keep track of you and to monitor you in the community, which is like, they're no, what does that do? How is that helpful, meaningful? So, when I came out and I saw these things, cause like, and you mind it, I'm educated, I'm smart, I can only imagine what the experience would be, or is like for people who are coming out from prison with none of those things, with no GED, with no training, with nothing. And considering the age in which we live in, you need to know, you need to be computer savvy. You need to be able to, work an iPhone. And a lot of these things just does not exist for many people coming out from prison. And so I think that if you want to look at, in terms of people coming out into the system and going into probation, I think they need to take a hard look at the role of probation and whether or not it should be more really rehabilitative as opposed to more structural, as opposed to being more punitive in nature. The recent COVID-19 situation, they had many people on Rikers Island sitting in Rikers Island for months on minor parole violation charges. And it costs this, it's not only is it a cost to the system, but it's a cost to each and every one of those individuals who have families, who have children. And so there needs to be much more thinking or thought on how these systems impact individuals as they try to reintegrate back into society.
Now, that was really helpful to kind of put it in concrete terms for us on just how like non-rehabilitative the transition is back into society after prison. And I know Tali, that's you're doing a lot of this work around post-conviction on parole, but also more broadly. So I'd love to hear how you're thinking about reforming some of those issues.
Yeah, so thank you, Adam, and Kingsley, thank you for that. And there's so much to respond to there. So I'll just talk a bit about how in Brooklyn, we've been thinking about some of the same issues and trying to understand what our role and responsibility is as prosecutors. I know that we're going to spend a big part of this discussion, and with Adam Mansky, the other Adam, talking about criminal justice reform at the front end. So who is entering the criminal justice system, obviously an incredibly important site of reform. What we tried to do in Brooklyn in the last few years is also to think about what are our responsibilities at the back end? What should we be doing for the folks that we sent into prison, and to really think that our job is to really see that person's trajectory all the way through until there is, an opportunity to return successfully to society. And so what we did is we built what we think is the first post-conviction justice bureau in the country. And it has 4 sort of units. One is the conviction review unit, which has been in the Brooklyn DA's office for a long time, sort of the national leader in going back and exonerating people whose convictions were wrongful. That's one part of it, which I won't get into. But we also tried to take on some of the other things that Kingsley's talked about. So parole and clemency. Parole, traditionally what prosecutors would do is at the time of the conviction and sentencing, just like write a letter opposing parole and stick it in the file. And 20 years later, somebody would take it out and say, the DA's office opposes parole. And we thought, well, no, that's not, how do we know that that is right in the context of who this person is now and what our values are now? And so we changed the rule in our office so that for people who pled guilty, which is, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, almost everybody who passes through the criminal justice system, we have like an over 95% guilty plea rather than conviction at trial rate. The default rule would be that you support parole because that's sort of the agreement we made with that person, that the minimum number of years in that agreement would be enough. And if you wanted to ask the ADA, that parole not be granted, you have to explain it to your supervisor. You have to justify it. As you can imagine, that meant that we mostly were supporting parole. We started to send our ADAs to prison to meet with people who were coming up for parole. We can't do it in every case yet. I think that's the dream, is for us to be much more actively engaged. But we now have relationships with organizations that can help put us in dialogue with people. We have taken it upon ourselves to try to at least be talking to the folks who are coming up for parole who are really young when they were convicted, because we know that age and culpability are connected, and we have to think about that, and that people change. We also are trying to support sealing. There's a statute in New York for, in some cases, you can seal your prior convictions so that you're not, as Kingsley says, barred from actually doing all the things you want to do once you're done with your prison sentence. I don't think that the statute personally in New York goes far enough. I think that people are still too encumbered by their criminal convictions, but at least with what we've got, we are trying to reach out to people and to help them go through that process. We've done some expungements where we don't just seal, but actually in the case of marijuana convictions that really reflect such a history of unnecessary law enforcement and racially discriminatory law enforcement, to just expunge those convictions, to say that we don't support them anymore. And the last piece of it, Adam, and this is sort of the hardest part, but I think to me this is the next frontier of criminal justice reform, is thinking about excessive sentencing. Some of these sentences were just too long. We wouldn't ask for them again today, and they're not justified anymore. A person is changed, is ready to go back, and there could be decades left on that person's sentence. And when that's true, parole is not enough, clemency is not enough. Where does that leave us? I think that we have to have a mechanism in this state and in other states for allowing people to come to court in some way and say, my sentence was excessive, hear me out, and for courts to decide that. And there are lots of different models swirling around. The district attorney in Brooklyn has drafted some legislation for one model. There are others out there, but I think in the end, like we're not going to be able to catch up and get to where we want to be unless we take that seriously.
I think another interesting aspect that you touched on is having the ability to make decisions in these tough cases, in these parole cases, and the discretion there, and how you think through that. And so I want to bring Deborah into the conversation and a question, I think, on that in that regard.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I think this is one of the best panels I've ever heard. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is I'm a civil prosecutor. So something that I think about a lot is treating everybody with dignity and respect, making sure that it's a fair punishment. But although I am civil, I want to make sure that people don't make the same mistake twice. So that's something that I think about a lot. And I just wonder in the criminal context, kind of how you can have a mechanism to make sure that people aren't being treated excessively, but that making sure that you're going to reduce recidivism.
You mind if I respond a little bit? So, I mean, I guess the question is, what is the appropriate response to offending? And I think that traditionally, and I want to use a phrase that I once saw Tali had used in an article or an op-ed piece, in the midst of the tough on crime era, the response was maximalist, going for the most extreme possible response, using the coercive power of the state to the utmost, whether at every point in the process where the system actors have the ability to constrain or limit or eliminate rights and liberties of the individuals coming before them. And that includes, the decision to stop someone, the decision to arrest, the decision to prosecute, or to hold someone in custody, to prosecute, to ask for bail, or or pretrial detention, and then ultimately sentencing. And on top of that, as Tali talked about, the legislated penalties of the criminal justice of the criminal laws became pretty extreme, and that's what excessive sentencing essentially is about. And I think that and I may not have the greatest connection now, so if you have a hard time hearing me, let me know. What I would just say is that if you only have a binary set of responses, and that's the way much of the system is operated, essentially jail or nothing, conviction or nothing, then all system players have a limited ability to act. And and it's a very heavy-handed response, or it's nothing, essentially. And what we have tried to do is to create across the continuum of the process options that we think are both more appropriate and beneficial, but also responding to the question, actually are better for public safety, better for reducing recidivism. And and that's part of what we do, create these different kinds of interventions, and then also, are working to document their effectiveness, because we want to make the case to the different players, including prosecutors, that this is, more effective. But at the end of the day, when we have a system that people are decrying, causing mass incarceration, creating school to prison pipelines, and so forth, we know that people are not looking at the traditional outcomes as being fair. And we believe that the kind of approach of diversion, the services and programming we're providing, is an option that reduces some of the harms that the system creates, and also can be seen as more fair.
Thank you.
Do you want to maybe zoom in a little bit more, Adam, on sort of what diversion looks like, and how you give, I don't want to say the appearance of fairness, but really reinforce that what you're doing, let's say in Red Hook, and you've expanded it more broadly since, is different than traditional courts?
Sure. So let me just ask you, I don't know if you're having a hard time
we're having a hard time seeing you, but at least I can hear you totally fine so far. So
okay, so what I'm going to do is just stop my video for now,
sure,
because it may strengthen, make sure that
sounds good,
you can't mishear me or whatever. Yeah, so just thinking about a place like the Red Hook Community Justice Center, a community court we created, we essentially decentralized the court system, working with the DA's office and the court system 20 some odd years ago, to bring a courtroom out into the community that we wanted to focus supporting and providing attention to, the neighborhood of Red Hook, Brooklyn. And in some ways, if you walk in, there are things that make it look like a regular courthouse. There are court officers, there is a judge, there are representatives from Tali's office, the Brooklyn DA's office, as well as defense attorneys. But when you walk in, we're also trying to send a message that this is different than a traditional response and a traditional justice process and system. And so, we've tried to change the way the place messages to people coming through, and that could include court officers being more friendly to the people coming through. It also includes not having kind of foreboding monolithic, marble or a mahogany to send a message that the system is all powerful, but kind of using, architectural vocabulary of big windows and white walls and, kind of openness. But most important are both the how the programming is different, and there we have the ability to. It is a regular traditional response system in that the judge could send someone to jail. But at the same time, what we've done is integrated social services into the very fabric of the process. So when the judge is trying to figure out what to do with a case, or the prosecutor is, they can use the traditional response, or we will have social workers in the courtroom who are ready to work with the defendant and essentially disrupt the process and make the use of these social services as easy for the judge and the prosecutors to use as the traditional outcomes. And I want to just touch on something that Kingsley mentioned, talking about his experience with his parole officer as law enforcement. In some ways, much of the programming that we do, whether it's in Red Hook or in the main courthouses around the city, is kind of like a quasi probation office role. We are supervising people who are involved in the justice system. But to be very clear, our approach is very much more focused on a clinical social services, social work approach, where we don't see ourselves as law enforcement. And at the same time, just to be clear, we are going to, make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to, but we want to help them get there. And so we're using our interactions with them as an opportunity to identify the needs they have and to help connect them to the services that can be helpful to them. In that way, maybe it's a little bit like what Kingsley probably does. And so those kind of interventions happen across the continuum of the process in a place like Red Hook or wherever else we, the many other places we're working around the city. It could be when the prosecutor's making a decision to prosecute the case. We've created an early intervention called Project Reset with the Brooklyn DA's office and other DA's offices. If the person agrees to participate in a brief service with, intervention, like facilitate a group with us, and they complete it, then the prosecutors decline to prosecute the case. The person has no record; they never even have to show up. That's at the earliest stage of the process. Once a person's in court, when the judge is deciding whether to set bail or release the person, sometimes that's a tricky decision. And so we've created a supervision program, a pretrial supervision program called supervised release, where the person is released to our social workers who will provide support and make sure that they participate in their court process. And then at the far end of the spectrum, when it comes time to sentencing, we've created a range of community-based services that can be used as sentences instead of the kinds of sentences that obviously the traditional response. We want to see those both instead of incarceration, but also where possible instead of conviction. And again, those can be for fairly serious cases or also for less serious ones.
That's great. And I wonder, Kingsley, do you want to kind of jump in, since you have some experience as well in the diversion space, sort of how much of a difference does that make towards some of the things you were talking about to people who have access to that? Do you want to unmute?
I wanted to comment on some other things that I heard. So I think many of the players need to sort of rethink their roles, much like the Red Hook criminal court, justice criminal, whatever. I'm sorry. So NYCDS, like we feel like as part of public defenders that, there is a continuum. Someone comes into the process. They go through the criminal process, and then they exit the criminal process. And we believe that, we work very hard to get offenders out of prison or out of jail. We try to very hard to not, so they can come out into society. We try very hard to fight their cases. But if they do go to prison or jail, we feel we have a responsibility to them that when they get out, that there will be someone there to help them reintegrate. And I think for many clients that we have, our outreach to many who have a year or less. And so we feel like that's a commitment we have, that we feel like we have. And I don't think a lot of times, I think in the past that hasn't been really thought of, in terms of what happens once they get through the system, and what role does public defense have in making sure that when people do re-enter society, same clients, that there's someone on the other side saying, hey, what's your name? I'm trying to bring you in. What help do you need? What services you need to be connected to? Regarding diversion programs, they're awesome. But many times I see diversion programs that are just like, like a conveyor belt, without really addressing the needs of the people who are in that particular diversion program. I think it's really hard sort of to do if you don't have the right structure or you don't have the right people in place. I mean, my thoughts with regard to probation, parole, or diversion programs are that there should be many more social workers on the staff than any other people hired. People should, in terms of engaging people who are in the community, there should be much more of a social service impetus to going out and meeting with clients and being helpful to them. Like I said, like we tend, like we did, I supervised clients in the community in terms of people with severe mental health issues. And, you know, is when I supervised them through the courts, it was much more in a clinical way. No such a thing. I'm going to report this. My sole concern as a social worker was to make sure they had every single services that they need to be productive and to be able to go through the court process and come out hopefully with a positive outcome, which is outcomes. That's what we look at, positive outcomes. So I think that when you do have diversion programs, that they need to be well thought out, and the services that are being designed for them really fit their needs and the needs that they have. Because, you know, as I said, like, you know, you have to be able to assess people for who they are, what's going on with them, and if you don't have that, if you don't have that in a process with regard to a diversion program, then it's not going to be successful. People are going to continue to roll back and forth, and it's not going to work.
Right. And so if diversion programs aren't really geared towards a rehabilitative aim, they can, you know, certainly there are cases where people roll through just like in, so it really always comes down to the people.
I wouldn't say most of the programs are like that, but, you know, there are programs that, you know, I look at that, you know, I evaluate, and I wouldn't work to send a client there because I feel like the services aren't adequate, and I feel like I've even myself have gone out to places where I have referred people myself to get an understanding of how clients are being engaged at those particular places. And so if I go into a place and someone doesn't ask me who I am or what's my name, and I've been sitting there for 30, 40 minutes, that's an issue. Or if someone's going to talk to me as if, you know, with no dignity or affirming my humanity, that's an issue. So I like to keep those things in mind with regard to my interaction with people. You know, the thing is, I always think about, like, how would I like to be treated? How would I like to be engaged? And I think people have to realize that, you know, and many, like, you know, humanity is first. People's humanity is first, and we have to always remember that. And there's always different aspects that you have to bring into it, and no one client is ever the same way, but we have to make sure that the client is the center of the diagram. They have to be center. They have to be the most important person and aspect. And I'm not talking about administrators and all these other things. I'm talking about the clients. So many of the times, I don't want to take up too much time. So many of the times, like when you go into these board meetings with these agencies, you don't see anyone of color. You don't see any representation of the people they themselves are supposed to be serving. You don't see any of those people there either. So how can an agency say, I can be an effective provider if the very people who are making decisions at the top are not represented in the room?
Yeah, that's important for us to be holding on to as we're going through this conversation. That's very well put. Tali, I wonder if you want to weigh in on the diversion programs and how your office uses that, or if you want to focus on, which I think is a big topic that I want to get to, on what you're doing in terms of law enforcement oversight.
Sure. So I can actually do either. Well, let me first, and we'll see if we have time for both. Let me round out a little bit on the diversion programs, just to offer just one other model of diversion, other than the great programs that we do with Adam that he has spoken about, that I think accounts for a lot of what Kingsley has said. So diversion has often been for relatively low-level crimes where the sentence would not be that long, usually something non-violent anyway. And a program that we have in Brooklyn that has been quite controversial but I think really important, and important to see through and measure the effects of is, it's actually two programs. I'm just going to talk about them together. Diversion for a violent crime, for gun possession. So possession of a gun, not using the gun, not brandishing the gun, but possession nonetheless, of a dangerous instrument. And that, you know, like the minimum sentence for that is like, it's like 3.5 years upstate. I mean, it's like a serious felony. And we have this small program in Brooklyn mostly for young men. There's a version of it that young women can participate in as well, where if you've never had a criminal record and you're charged with this and some other felonies as well, you can get selected to go into this program where, depending on the program, either for a year or 18 months or for 2 years, you do a very intensive, tailor-made program. And you plead guilty to the charges at the beginning, but the promise is that if you complete this program, then the charges against you can be dismissed, or you can be sentenced to no jail time. And I think, you know, for us to be able to prove that that works can actually be revolutionary, and so far it seems like it does. So a couple of things just to observe about that. One is, this is really Eric Gonzalez's innovation, was to put a social worker in charge of that program, because how are we best equipped, you know, folks who went to law school only, to be able to figure out who has a good chance of succeeding in a program like this and what that person needs, right? And part of the program is mentorship that's going to come from that social worker. And I think that, you know, that has to be a theme in criminal justice reform as the role of the DA gets more complicated and the role of law enforcement gets more complicated. People with different skills have to be participating in this project of public safety. And I just plant that as like as a concept, as a seed, as we think about this conversation we're having as a country about what police reform should look like. The other thing I think about that program, and this is resonant with something I talked about before that I think is really important, is that, you know, the DA has said when he's defending this, it's unconscionable to give up on people when they're so young. And we have to sort of believe that we can do better, and we have to be creative. And so, you know, we have a system where we can charge them with this thing and they can go upstate for 3.5 years. And we know that that's a really hardening experience, and really probably does not set someone up to return to the community as a young person and to do well. And also, to be honest, those cases we also would often lose when we tried, you know, to take them to trial, because juries did something called nullification often, which is to say they just didn't want, even if the facts made out the crime, they didn't want to convict somebody and sentence them to that fate, right? And so I have great hope in this, and I think it's worth sort of putting on the table that diversion can really, it can be done in places where we thought it could not be done before. I fear that do you want me to keep going, or do you want to open it up? Because
that's great. We're actually like looking, there's some, we're getting a little bit short on time. So I think we have unfortunately some great questions we're probably not going to get to this time, but I would love to get a kind of concluding thought from everybody, but there's, you know, this conversation keep going on. So I guess just as we're in this moment where these norms of criminal justice are being challenged, and there's this kind of call to defund the police and really push ourselves to think in bigger ways, I'm wondering how all three of you, I think, are thinking at this moment about what we should aim for, where we should be in 10, 20 years. And I'll start, if Kingsley, if you want to jump in and start.
Yeah, great. So this is very exciting times. I don't know, it's just very exciting times because I've never seen anything in my lifetime like this. And, you know, in light of what happened, you know, sometimes you tend to think that you live in this bubble, and it's like, you know, things are all horrible and everything's bad. But, you know, looking at these protests over the last few weeks, you know, I've been really heartened and impressed and crying and laughing because it's, when you see the people out there, Black Lives Matters is much more important to them they said that they said that in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, that public opinion had changed from 30% to 75% people who feel that Black Lives Matter and that this is important. But, and I understand, like, people say defund the police, and I guess I would want to know what people mean by that. I think proactive policing is ridiculous. I think there's something must be done about that. I think, de Blasio and those guys have cut that unit off. But I just think that there has to be in this moment more accountability for cops. There must be more community input into the cops that are patrolling these neighborhoods. When I was a child, I knew the officers in my community. I knew the officers who walked my beat. It was rare that I would see a white officer in my community because, like, I knew it. My mother knew the officer in the community. My neighbors knew the officers in the community. And if anything went wrong in the community, that cop, he or she knew exactly how to find out what was wrong and how to get there without beating people up or brutalizing them or things of that nature. But I just think that they have to have some sort of standard. If you are going to give someone a gun and put them out there and for them to hold the law, they must be held to a higher standard than anyone because they have the ability to take someone's life. And so I would hope that everyone would think very critically about those issues. I mean, for a lot of times I would tell friends, you don't want to walk in my shoes. My wife, her mother lives in the Berkshires, and she's up there and she says, Kingsley, will you want to come and drive up there and come see me, or come to me. And I will not drive the car to Massachusetts from New York City because I'm afraid that I might get stopped by police. It makes me extremely uncomfortable to drive into upstate in towns that it's very uncomfortable. And so these are the sort of things that I have to deal with regard to law enforcement. There has to be a change in the tone. I saw the officers about 2 days ago on TV screaming about officers not thugs and this and that. I thought it was appalling. I thought it was embarrassing. It was an embarrassment because people are not screaming out for, all people want accountability. And what is wrong with accountability? If you're like, we need accountability. Too many African-American males getting shot in the head and nothing is done about it. At 12 years old, I was out in the street with my friend and a cop picked me up and asked me no questions. He picked me up and he put me in the back of his car with two of my other friends. And they put us in a lineup in the car. Told the lady to come over. Are these the individuals that did this to you? And thank goodness the lady said no, that wasn't them. But this is a sort of violations that many people like myself and people go through every day. And so looking at the criminal justice system, but looking at it all in totality, and the way we look at justice and the people who are dispensing justice, there needs to be some sort of transparency in order for us to move forward. There must be an acknowledgement that African Americans have been basically being slaughtered by police officers. There must be an acknowledgement. I just heard somebody in the in Trump's cabinet say he didn't believe there was non-systemic racism in the United States. What planet is this guy living on? Who says things like that? It's just like a slap in the face. I'll leave you with this. They brought us over here in chains, right? They stole me from my country, brought me here in slaves, as a slave. They enchained me, they brutalized me, they beat me, they separated my children. After that we were free, they redlined us, Jim Crow, institutional racism up until this point. And then the crux of the matter, they say, it's your fault. It's your fault you're in a situation you're in. It's your fault that your communities suck. It's your fault that you don't have capital. And you're saying, what are you talking about? Have you even examined the history of us in this country? It just makes no sense. So, I think this needs to be a lot of discussion, particularly among white people, but also Black people too. I always check in. I mean, if you want to check in, I check in with myself. You need to check in with yourself and check in with your friends and speak to your friends, because Black African Americans, Black people, we've been talking about this for years, and it's something that we're sort of used to dealing with.
Thank you for putting in such.
I'm sorry, I went out on a tangent.
No, that was really powerful and really grateful to you for putting in such stark terms. So no, thank you. And so after hearing that, Adam, I wonder how you're thinking about what you raised at the beginning, the sort of struggle between reform from the inside and reform from the outside, and what this moment calls for.
I mean, what could I say that compares to that? That's what this moment is about. That's incredibly powerful. I certainly can talk about the value of diversion and the fact that diversion should not be diversion. It should be the prime outcome, right? That if we think of it as diversion, we're diverting people out of the traditional system. Well, this is what should be the traditional system, the way Kingsley spoke about the focus on social services. But much more important at this moment is what Kingsley addressed just now. And I think that the experiences he's had and all African Americans have had time immemorial, or some people, whatever. This has been a time where for many of us white people, our eyes are opening, maybe hundreds of years too late. But I think that what you said, Kingsley, speaks for itself, and there's not much I can add to that.
No, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
And I wonder if, as we conclude, Tali, and how you're sensing, and you're speaking, I know, on behalf of yourself and not the office, but sort of what you feel the responsibility of the office is at this moment, and what you're thinking going forward.
Well, first of all, let me just thank my co-panelists, Kingsley and Adam, for just being so open and for the work that you do. I'm going to say in partnership to us. And, I think just the last thing I will say, because I think we've got a bunch of young people on this call, is, Adam, I understand that struggle of where should I be working? Should I be working on the inside? Should I be working on the outside? My students often ask me that a lot, and I'm going to borrow from something a colleague says, which is, when you've got a car stuck in a ditch, you just have to go where you think you can use your skills to help push it out. So maybe you should be the driver, you should be at the back, or you should be at the front, or you should make the plan and not be, not have your, not be leaning into it physically. And I find that, it's actually a really deeply personal question, like where is the place that you could be the most effective? I think you might connect to where I started this conversation to what I'm about to say, which is, for me, I feel the most empowered being inside, having felt excluded, to be able to go inside the institutions that I want to change and be myself a government actor. And that it doesn't really matter as long as you are committed. And I really do think we are all doing the same work. And to me, that's the most important thing. So thank you all, and happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth. Thank you, everybody, for a really tremendously powerful conversation. Kingsley, Tali, Adam, really grateful. We are over, so I'm not going to spend any more time. But
thank you so much. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Everyone's here. I was telling Adam before this was over that, sometimes you get tired of explaining who you are, like every time, but no matter how tired I am, if there's an opportunity to change minds and hearts, I don't care how tired I am, I'm going there, because, it's an opportunity to change minds and hearts. And so, I can be dead tired. Listen, I'm there. I'm trying to change minds and hearts.
Thank you for leaving us on that. And thank you, everybody. We'll really appreciate it.
Good evening. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.